Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. A weekly feature on 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com. Here's the president of the Lake George Battlefield Alliance, John Denuzzo.
So Pat Niles, thanks again for coming back to Lake George Battlefield Moments. We're talking about Carleton's raid as it impacted Lake George and Fort George. It's October 1780. Major Christopher Carleton and his raiders have wreaked havoc across the lower Lake Champlain region, Washington County, Saratoga County, Warren County. They approached Lake George. Can you tell us the story of what happened?
As they approach Lake George, they are confronted by a few soldiers, basically looking for supplies. They're going to Fort Edward. When these few American soldiers see the Native Americans and see the loyalists, they turn around, they go back to the fort. And Chipman makes a decision. He doesn't know. The interesting thing with this is that everybody else in the area knows what's going on. Chipman never was informed that the British were raiding. They're that isolated. It's amazing.
He didn't know about Kingsbury and Fort Anne and all
Not
that?
at all. Not at all. Because they had... Sherwood, who had been with a Colonel Livingston, who was the commander of Fort Edward, they had had dinner the day before. Sherwood was heading towards Salem. Some called it New Perth at that time. There was military there as well. He stopped to have dinner, Sherwood, and the information came in from the north that there were raiders. They didn't know how many. They certainly didn't know there were 1,000 men with them. Sherwood immediately went back to Fort Anne. Livingston didn't, he prepared himself, but he didn't send a message up to John Chipman. So Chipman is really flat-footed. Seth Warner was the commander of those Continentals at Fort George. And if he'd been there, they might have had a different outcome. I don't think they would have beaten him, but...
Where was he?
He was wounded. He'd been wounded about a month before. He'd been shot coming through on the military road around Queensbury. And so he was on leave, or he was in the hospital, or he was in somewhere around. So Chipman was kind of the third man down, and the other man was no longer there, the man above him. So Chipman was the least of all this. And Chipman had a tough go of it. Chipman was from Vermont, as most of these people in the Warner's brigade were. Chipman's house was one of the first houses burned by Christopher Carleton in 1778 when he went through Vermont at that time. So Carleton got him twice at this unfortunate time for him.
Okay. So we're looking at Bloody Pond again. It's
right.
Obviously a very notorious place from the Battle of Lake George in 1755. And now Bloody Pond again plays a role?
Right. Bloody Pond is where Carleton's men had gotten to. The scouts for Carleton had seen the Americans out there. They go back to Carleton. Carleton ends up sending more men out looking for them. Well, they don't match up because the Americans, 50 of them, come out, but they don't go down the military road. They go another way. They bypass each other. And so the scouts come back to Carleton again. He sends out more men, more regulars. And what they do at that point is they keep basically searching for each other until finally there is a small group of Native Americans that had originally been there. They're at the base of Gage's Hill. Those 50 attack these Native Americans, which is about a dozen of them. The 34th, who's out searching, finally gets involved rather quickly, and this thing ends up pretty bloody for the Americans because they are killed, and the Native Americans scalp every single one of them except for one.
At Bloody Pond?
Right between Bloody Pond and Gage's Hill, right at the base of Gage's Hill.
Okay. So,
right in that whole area is where, when you drive through under that light, that is where it happened.
So what kind of shape was Fort George in 1780? You said Chipman, it was a small detachment, I guess, kind of guarding that? Or what were they?
Fort George. It had been burned several times. They still occupied it. It was small. You still had the stone walls. The well didn't work. They had 3 pieces of artillery. They had 1 6-pounder that was on the ground, basically. They had another 6-pounder that was in a carriage that was, the wheels had fallen off. And the third one was presented up on the wall. So you got 3 pieces of artillery there. And what Chipman has left is 24 men. He only had 70-some to begin with. So this is what they have up here. They don't have a lot of military. They just don't. The war has moved on, and basically they're told by Washington, we don't have enough guys to send you up there. So deal with it.
So they get wiped out.
They get wiped out.
And what do the British under Carleton do to the fort at that point?
What they end up doing is eventually, once Chipman takes a surrender, the first thing that they allow to happen is the Native Americans go in and plunder. They are looking for plunder. They're not paying them. That is one of the things that they get from this.
And plunder meaning
they
what?
Take whatever is there. Whatever is worthwhile, they're going to take. If it's ammunition, they're going to take ammunition. That's another point. I mean, they only had like 3 or 4 rounds apiece with the Americans. I mean, they couldn't have any sustained type of fight at all. But they will take clothing, they will take food, they will take money, they will take whatever they can take at that point. The British then, once they're satisfied, meaning the Native Americans, they will take them back out. They put the prisoners into Fort George that night. They put the 53rd Regiment in front of the door so the Native Americans cannot attack, and they camp outside Fort George at that night. Now, the next day, they end up, Carleton, and we didn't talk about this in the first session, Carleton, when he gets to South Bay, he sends back his boats to Ticonderoga. He sends back 3 bateaux that are to be taken over the river in Ticonderoga to portage it, and then put cohorns on, because originally the plan was the cohorns will show up, they'll put a siege on. They didn't need it at that point. So they show up in the morning. Carleton, that particular day that he had taken the fort, had sent his soldiers out to raise bateaux. And, of course, we know the sunken fleet. They go out, they find the sunken fleet, they raise about 20 of them and let them dry out, put them back in the water, and what they do is they put the women and children, because there were women and children, loyalists that had come, they're put in there. The wounded are put in these bateaux. Some of the prisoners that really aren't in good enough shape are put there, and they are sent north. They'll make the portage again to Ticonderoga to Lake Champlain. Carleton's men then go up the west side of Lake George, they call Rogers Road, and they will march, for about 60 miles. They go all the way up to Ticonderoga and eventually Crown Point.
Wow. And that's the end of the story.
No. It's not the end of the story. The Americans, the British at that time, they not only wanted to depopulate the area, they wanted to demoralize the government. And so they finally get on the boats, Ticonderoga, Crown Point, and they get a message. They're heading back because it's the end of October. And the British are sending down another set of ships. And they have on that ship the head of he will become the head of the intelligence for Canada. His name is Justin Sherwood. And he is being sent into Vermont. And he is to meet with Ethan Allen to negotiate Vermont, or the New Hampshire grants, going with the British. Frederick Haldeman wasn't optimistic that was going to happen, but he knew it put pressure on the Americans, and that's what he was doing. So Carleton's guys are on the lake and these 8 boats, and they're going from the middle of October, whenever the raid got done, until basically the first week in November. They went up and down, and they were told to go up and down. They would go all the way up to Crown Point. They'd come all the way back down. They'd have a picnic or whatever at Mount Independence, this, that. what it was doing was it was driving, if you look at the intelligence going to Governor Clinton, it was driving them crazy. They didn't know where the Americans were, and they couldn't do anything about it. And that made it worse. And that is one of the reasons why the Americans, settlers, end up losing faith in the New York government at that time, because there are several communities within the next year that join with Vermont, and because Vermont had promised that they could take care of them at that point. So this raid has an after effect, and it is about losing confidence in government.
Interesting. Now, longtime Battlefield Park Alliance trustee Russ Bellico has written several books, one of which is my favorite, Empires in the Mountains, which kind of takes this story into account among all that happened on Lake Champlain, Lake George during this era. Is there any other reference books that you would recommend if we're listening?
I go back to Gavin Watt's book. He's got 8 of them. No Turning Point, again, got into that end of the story as well,
Okay.
the whole after effect.
Well, thanks again, Pat. It's been very, very interesting, very thought-provoking on all the history that has taken place, even this little snippet of 1780, important stuff in American history. Thanks for joining us, and again, I encourage people to go to our website, lakegeorgebattlefieldpark.org, or to our YouTube channel, and hear a lot of our former programs, podcasts, Lake George Battlefield Moments, and so on.
Thank you, John. I appreciate you having me.
Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. For more on this topic, check out the Lake George Battlefield Alliance podcast, a weekly feature on Lake FM 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com. For more information, go to info@lakegeorgebattlefield.org and tune in every Saturday morning for Lake George Battlefield Moments,